First time, Anil Seth, one of the other organisers at the Sun School, but I just would like to introduce you to the first talk in the consciousness-related presentation is going to be by Kevin O'Regan. Kevin lives and works in Paris, and he's done a lot of seminal work on change blindness, and especially the idea that consciousness is something we do, conscious experience of the things that we do. So that's all I'll say, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing him talk.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. Looking forward to interacting with all of you, and also very happy to be in this beautiful city. When I was a child, I was fascinated by the idea of making a conscious robot, a machine that thinks. And one day, when I was around 10 years old, I came across this ad. In a popular science magazine. I think I'll use this.
Take it out, this out?
Yeah, well, maybe.
Sorry, this. Just in case. Have another mic.
It's okay.
All right, we're continuing.
Okay, so when I was a child, I came across this ad in a popular science magazine for a machine that thinks. This was in the 1960s. And it had all sorts of complicated lights and dials, and the circuit diagram of this machine that played tic-tac-toe looked fascinating to me. And I spent a whole week feverishly wiring the thing up. And when I got done, the machine played wonderful tic-tac-toe. But I was sort of disappointed. I really felt the machine couldn't really think, and it didn't really have consciousness. And I wondered what was missing in the machine so that I could make it conscious. What extra module would I have to put into the machine so that it could really think? Now, this is a problem that, of course, since the 1960s has preoccupied a lot of people. And obviously, it started with artificial intelligence in the 1960s and 70s. People were trying to make machines that think. And they started off by making machines that could do symbol manipulation, maybe on large databases, creating what they called expert systems. And they found that they could make these machines solve problems like playing chess or drafts. And ultimately, they're being used today very efficiently in programs that do medical diagnosis or helping finding geological deposits or every day doing airline reservations. These are machines that in some sense think. More recently, people have been constructing machines that perceive in the way animals and humans do. I mean, more recent neural network architectures based on statistical methods are doing things like machine learning, pattern recognition, character recognition, speech recognition. These are things that are gradually improving in efficiency over the last decades. We're having a bit of problem with continuous speech recognition and handwriting recognition, but I think there's no reason why, with the advance of technology, we won't achieve good machine perception. What about language? Language seems to be a little bit more of a problem. We have machines that understand a little bit of language, but problems like reference, metaphor, context, humor, these are things that we have not really been able to build into machines. But again, there is hope, in particular with the advent of autonomous robotics, developmental robotics, that these problems that we have with language might be solved when we build robots into social systems where they come to interact with each other and where they have bodies inserted in a real world. And I think there is faith among the artificial intelligence community, the robotic community, that we will soon, in the next decades, have machines that communicate and understand language in a way which is approaching that of humans. There does seem to be a bit of a problem with the notion of the self. We as humans feel that we have a self. Can we build a self into a machine? I think the answer is yes. And I think there is faith these days that we will be able to build a self into a machine. I think there are two kinds of selves. There's what I call the cognitive self and the notion of I. The cognitive self, one might distinguish three types of cognitive self. At the lowest level, a self is something that is distinguished from the environment. And that is something that we can easily build into a robot. A robot moves its arms around, and we can build into it bits of the algorithm that prevent the robot hitting itself when it moves, for example. So it has to distinguish its own body from the external world and from itself. So self-distinguishing is perhaps the lowest level of selfhood. A next level of selfhood is knowledge of the fact that this entity has goals and has plans that it's attempting to achieve. So a bird, for example, will perhaps hide its food so that its food is not found by other birds. In order to do this, its brain must have some notion of itself, it as an entity, as distinguished from other birds. Of course, but this level of self-knowledge is not a high level, because the bird doesn't know that it has this knowledge. Okay? The bird just does these things, which indicate that it has a certain level of knowledge of the self, but it hasn't got a meta level where it knows that it has that knowledge. This extra level, the meta level, I call knowledge of self-knowledge, and is approximating what psychologists and cognitive scientists call the theory of mind. And Daniel Dennett, the philosopher, talks about the intentional stance, and it's quite related to what Jürgen Jost was saying a minute ago. Having the notion of intention requires a higher level of cognitive ability, and involves having beliefs, desires, motivations. This involves knowledge of self-knowledge, and it gives rise to social forms of interaction and social emotions like shame, pride, embarrassment, and contempt. But all this seems to be part of a cognitive capacity. It seems that we could build this into machines with sufficient degree of complexity. It's no doubt a difficult problem, okay? But it's a problem which we don't see any logical reason to think that we could not solve. These are problems that are difficult, but they seem to be logically solvable. So I would say they are accessible to science.
You expect us now to believe in that?
Well, I think that the reason you are all here is because that is what you believe. You believe that these capacities are essentially accessible to science. Maybe it's decades away, but there's no logical problem. But there is a logical problem with another thing which I will call feel. I'm going to come to that. There's a logical problem that I'm coming to later. But here I was talking about the cognitive self, which is accessible to science. There's another aspect of the self, which is what I call the notion of I. So we all, as humans, have the strong impression that there's someone, namely ourselves, somehow behind the commands. It's I doing the thinking, the acting and the deciding and the feeling. And where does this notion come from? This feel that I have that I really exist and that I am doing this. Now you might think this is a bit magical, but social scientists have worked a lot, cognitive scientists have worked a lot on this notion of I, and the status of science in this domain is to believe that the notion of I is really a cognitive construct. It is a useful abstraction that these entities, ourselves, have constructed cognitively from the way we behave and from our capacities in order to talk about how this entity interacts in a social environment. It is what the philosopher Daniel Dennett has called a narrative fiction. It's a story we ourselves tell ourselves in order to account for what these entities do in a social context. But in that case, if this is true, it seems rather shocking to think that the thing that I call I and that I feel so intimately is just a story that this entity cognitively is telling itself. If it's just a fiction, why does it feel to us to be so real? How can a fiction seem real to us? And I think...
But wait, at some level, the I you get for free because you are a physical agent.
Yes.
So isn't the problem more coming in at the level of the attributions you're making to this I?
Yes, I mean, that's what I was sort of saying when I was saying there was the cognitive self here are this low-level entity part, okay? But there's something more, which is the way I feel about it. And that, I think, seems sort of somewhat magical to people. And that, I think, needs a bit of explanation. But I think there is this social psychology type explanation of it, which is suggested by Dennett and social psychologists today, that it is just a story that we are telling ourselves. But the question is, why does it feel to be so real? And I suggest that the reason it feels so real is that it has two properties. This story has two properties which make it seem really real. And one part of the story that makes it feel real is that it is part of the story to think that it is real. The story is a self-validating story. The story is a story according to which the story is real. Okay? And I wouldn't be telling myself this story if it wasn't part of the story that the story was real. Okay? But it's a big illusion. It's a big illusion, and it's just a story. Now, why does that feel real? And I make the analogy with money. Money is just bits of paper. It's just bits of metal. And yet, it's very real. We, in our society, have a convention according to which this entity, namely money, is extremely important. And we believe in it, despite the fact that we all know that it's just bits of metal and bits of paper. So it is self-validating within a social context. And I suggest the notion of I is a similar self-validating notion within a social context, namely the context of our human society. But there is something more. Namely, the story of I has something even more interesting. It is self-referring. The I refers to the I in the story. So it's rather more complicated than money, because money doesn't know about money, whereas I know about I. So it's self-referring in addition to being self-validating. It's a bit like some modern novels, where the novel consists of the story of the man writing the novel itself that is being written and changing the characters. There's a story by Flann O'Brien called The Third Policeman, which is a wonderful story where the story writer is writing the story about himself writing the story.
I don't want to derail your argument. So in that sense, you can just tell me when I should postpone my question, okay. All right? There's no problem. But up to this point, I don't feel like this amazement that you seem to be projecting, right? So did I miss something, or should I just wait?
Amazement?
Yeah,
well,
because
it's
you
amazing.
seem to be saying, like, it is amazing that we have this sense of I, and it's sort of magical.
No, I'm saying it's amazing that
it's
amazing to think that if I'm right, this I is just an illusion. It's a story.
Yeah, but it's amazing to think that this bottle is an illusion.
Well, most people think it's really physically existing, the bottle.
That's what I'm saying.
I didn't understand.
That's exactly my point. I didn't understand yet what this amazement is that you're trying to convey to me, right? So is this like a straw man, or let's say, is this one position in the discussion on self that you want to analyze and argue against, and then you're going to give us some experience?
No, I believe this. I believe this. I think that most people have difficulty believing this.
Ah, right, good. So I'm then one of most people. So then you have to convince me why I should believe this, I guess.
Well, this is really only the introduction to my talk. And what I'm saying is...
good. So
I'm not going to try and make you believe this. I believe, from my readings of current social psychology, this is what most social psychologists and cognitive scientists think explains the notion of I. And so I don't want to convince you. Just go and read the literature, and you'll see that everybody else is convinced that this is the
Maybe I
case.
read it, and I'm still not convinced.
Oh. Well, we read differently then. Because, I mean, let me give you some empirical suggestions.
No, sure. So
Okay?
then-
So this would be empirical.
I'll report back to you later.
Okay. Well, we can have an argument about this. So if I'm right, and if social psychologists are right, that the I is just a construct like this, well, then why can't we just jump out of it somehow and change the notion of I? If it's just a story, why am I not able to simply change the story with a flick of my finger? Of course, one point is that part of the story is that I can't change the story. So I'd have to really kind of have a kind of meta belief about the story in order to be able to jump out of the story. But I suggest that there are cases where one can break the taboo of believing in one's own story, and these are cases where one can do it voluntarily under what are called culturally bound syndromes. So culturally bound syndromes are states of the sense of I that are changed by stressful social situations where it's useful for this I to jump out of the social situation where I consider myself to be who I usually am, and I take the choice of jumping out and becoming somebody different. And this happens, for example, in possession trances or ecstasies and other cases where my I can change voluntarily by me putting myself into some peculiar mental state. There are these very interesting phenomena called, well, many of you have no doubt heard of amok, the syndrome of amok in Indonesia, where somebody will suddenly go completely crazy and take a knife and kill people around them, and then a couple of hours later they kind of fall asleep, and when they wake up they're completely unaware of what has happened. And people seem to take, in Indonesia, people take this as a kind of normal behavior and they accept it. And it's actually a socially acceptable behavior to run amok in this way. And there are other syndromes. There's a syndrome called Lata, which takes place in many different societies throughout the world, where you come up to somebody and you say, boo! And the person jumps up and changes his personality suddenly and becomes immediately susceptible to completely imitating you. If you say boo to the person, then the person will do anything you say and will start blabbering pornographic words and will be in this very peculiar state for a little while. And again, this seems to be a socially induced syndrome, socially bound syndrome. And there's others. Koro is another one. And hypnosis. Hypnosis is very interesting, because hypnosis is a similar state where somebody is willing to change their own character just under the suggestion of the hypnotist. And what's interesting about hypnosis is that you can hypnotize somebody extremely easily. If you look at any textbook on hypnosis, in the appendix of the hypnosis textbook, you'll find a hypnotizing script where it says, now imagine your eyes are getting very heavy, blah, blah. And it gives you a whole series of steps, and at the end, the person is hypnotized. And if you just take the piece of paper where this is written and you read it to somebody, the person becomes hypnotized. And as I understand reading the literature on hypnosis, people believe that, in fact, hypnosis is essentially a socially bound syndrome, like these other syndromes. Hypnosis is not possible in a society where nobody knows what hypnosis is. It's impossible to hypnotize somebody who doesn't believe in hypnosis. Hypnosis is just a way that a person can accept to change his character under the suggestion of somebody else. It's not any special state. People believe it is what is called the culturally bound syndrome. And I think these are evidence for the idea that the notion of I may be a story as I suggest. Pardon me? Koro is a syndrome that occurred in Tanzania in maybe about 15 years ago, where suddenly there was a story being told in Tanzania, according to which if you came across a white man who would shake your hand or who would comb his hair and give you the comb, your genitals would retract into your body. And people actually believed this. And it was so widespread a belief that people had to go to hospital, and the government had to put out a special instructions to try and calm people down. It was a really real belief that people had. So, and then one can, of course, change one's... Yes?
You said hypnosis, you had to believe about it to be hypnotized.
Yeah.
The first experience on hypnosis, the hypnotist so define or the patient or was not believing something, or how do you...
Well, hypnotism has a whole history, okay, and it started off with animal magnetism and Mesmer and so on, who kind of invented this, put people into situations where he told them stories about magnetism and stuff, and made a big kind of show about it, and gradually made publicity about it. People came to his performances, and people began to know about it gradually. And historically in our society, there's an image of what hypnosis consists of, and I think that really determines what people do under hypnosis. But that's not to say that hypnosis is not real. Hypnosis is real. It really works. It changes your brain state, and people use hypnosis every day now and more in surgery, for example. And it's a medically more and more accepted procedure for reducing pain in surgery. In fact, I've read several review articles about hypnosis and about pain where they claim that it is the most effective way of reducing pain in surgery. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm saying it's real, but it's a story, and the reason these stories are real is because we ourselves are just stories.
Kevin, there's also an interesting, I don't know if you've read this stuff, probably you have, I'm sure you have, hypnosis, where people are hypnotized to see black and white images in color, for example, and you see under neuroimaging that then you see increased activity in V4, which corresponds to their subjective reports that they do in fact see the images in color, and there have been things like Stroop experiments and so on also consistent with that. But I don't think it only works if you believe in it.
Well, there's a strong correlation.
There's a strong correlation. In fact, one of the mysteries of hypnosis is nobody's found... People have always looked for, well, what correlates with the hypnotizability of somebody, and it's not IQ, it's not any other personality trait, it's only the extent to which somebody believes that they might be hypnotizable is the only thing that seems to correlate with hypnotizability, which is sort of self-referential, but...
And it corresponds exactly to what I would predict if it's a culturally bound syndrome like this.
Is your distinction in voluntary and involuntary essential for your argument?
No, not at all.
Okay.
No, it's just two different ways of breaking the taboo. The voluntary one is a way that you would predict if the thing is a story. But of course that doesn't exclude that there would be involuntary ways of changing one's character by, for example, a brain lesion that makes you lose your memory, or under extremely strong stress, for example, under post-traumatic stress disorder, brainwashing, cults and war, where you're in such a state of stress that you have to change yourself in order to adapt to the stressful situation. And there's the phenomenon of dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorders, where people actually have several selves, where they can switch from one self to the other, and these selves are each very real to them.
Saying it as a story is a bit dismissive, because really, I mean, what we're saying is it's a construct.
But
then going back to Paul's point, the bottle is a construct as well. So I mean, just about anything that...
Yes, but it's not self-referential. But what's amazing about the self is that it is a self-validating and self-referential construct, and that we should feel it in such a real way that we really exist, despite the fact that we are just constructing ourselves as we go along.
So maybe you're going to get...
It's not exceptional in that way. I mean, there's lots of constructs that are going to have a big impact on me, sort of constructs about members of my family, the construct of being in love, all these other things.
Yeah, undoubtedly, yeah. Okay, but as I was saying to Paul here, that this was just an introduction. I was trying to build consciousness into a machine, okay? I was suggesting that artificial intelligence was making machines that think. We have machines that perceive, we have machines with language. We even may be able to understand the notion of self, and there's nothing logical. It's a bizarre concept, okay? But nevertheless, there's nothing logically that's preventing us from thinking that within the next decades we won't be able to understand this stuff here, okay? There's no logical problem. However, there seems to be a logical problem. So these are accessible to science, but there seems to be a logical problem with something else. Feel. When you pinch me, I really feel the pain. When I see a red expanse of color, there's something it's like to me to feel that redness. This is the problem that the philosophers have distinguished from these other problems. Philosophers say these problems can be brought together into one heading which they would call access consciousness. We can understand how one could construct a cognitive system that uses artificial intelligence type symbol manipulation, cognitive, perhaps also neural nets and stuff like this. These can all give rise to this stuff. This is access consciousness. But there's something else, the what it is like to feel, which the philosopher Ned Block has distinguished from access consciousness and calls phenomenal consciousness, or what philosophers call qualia, the quality of experience. This seems to pose more of a problem. And the philosophers have called this the hard problem.
Can you explain a little bit more the difference between what we call the machines that perceive and feel?
Well, you could imagine, that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to imagine, for example, I'm going to try and expand more why this is a problem, okay? So let's look at color, okay? This is the typical problem of philosophers, the qualia of red. Why does red seem red to us? Now, the neuroscientists will say, when you look at a colored piece of paper or colored light, you have three types of cones in your retina that distinguish it, that are sensitive to different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. And these cones feed into a neural stage where they're combined into three channels: the blue-yellow channel, the green-red channel, and the black-white channel, or the brightness channel. And these channels, it's shown in the lower levels of the visual system, are constructed by combining algebraically the outputs of the different cone types. And they would say the reason you see something as red when it's red is that the red-green channel is activated maximally in the red direction when you see red. The quality of redness arises because in the brain you have a channel that is maximally activated when you see red. And similarly for green, yellow, blue, and blue. And at first people thought the fact that you have these four colors, red, green, yellow, and blue, which are known to be somehow basic and are seen, as are felt by all of us, to be somehow much more prototypical colors than, say, orange or gray or pink. The reason these colors are important is precisely because they correspond to the channels that exist neurophysiologically. This is the classical story about color. You'll read it in all the textbooks. However, color scientists actually really know that that is not the right story. Because if you look at what happens when you activate the red channel in the maximum way, people actually do not see red. And similarly for the other channels. So this is some data showing activation of the different channels. The red-green channel, if the red-green channel actually gave rise to pure red or pure green sensations, then the data here should lie on orthogonal axes. But what is shown by a number of different studies over the last decade, yeah.
Sorry, what's the experiment?
Okay, so this is an experiment where you show people different colored lights, and you measure the activation of the different channels, and this is actually the L minus the M channel. Well, psychophysically, you know how the different channels respond. You know the spectrum of each of the photoreceptors, and so you know how the L and the M channels are going to respond, and you adjust your lights in such a way that you can measure the difference between the L and the M channels. And the same for the S, L, and for the S channel, the short wavelength channel. No, these are. You show people lights that have, say, a particular, let's take this light, okay? It's got a certain difference between the L and the M channel because you've adjusted the light and you know mathematically how the channel is going to respond, and you know how the S channel is going to respond. And you ask people what, you adjust it so that people say it looks pure green. And if the theory were right and pure green were really corresponded to maximal activation of only the L and M channel and no S minus L plus M channel, no blue-yellow channel, then all these points should be on this horizontal line. And yet they're not. In order to see something as pure green, it has to have some yellow in it.
But then they would just suggest to get this kind of psychophysics, you just look at the different statistic of the channels.
No, it's a matter of what they're doing now. People nowadays, they say, well, actually, instead of doing the normal sums, L minus M and S minus L plus M, we have to do some other algebra to correct this, to rotate things around.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Right?
But I mean, the physiology is not compatible with that. There's nothing in the physiology suggesting that one should have these different combinations. The physiology really does suggest L minus M and an S plus L plus M channel.
Physiology, the rods and the cones, or
yeah,
neural computation.
the low-level visual system in the lateral geniculate and stuff.
So when the red-green channel, well, so-called, is fully saturated, what do you experience? Purple? Or was it
Sorry, when you have what?
If you just fully saturate the red-green channel, do you experience purple rather than red? What happens?
Fully saturate? You mean you have nothing in the...
So you're saying that when those neurons are fully activated, you don't experience red, which is what was expected. You experience another color. What was that color?
Well, when the red channel is maximally active, when the red channel is maximally... I can't read it off the graph. It must be some... You should be able to read it off the graph. A color scientist will tell you.
But I'm just curious. So the argument is that there are these primary colors,
Yep.
and we expect them to match up to the channel.
But they don't.
But they don't. Maybe we were wrong about the primary colors, and whatever it is that the red channel